but we'll see how we go.
Actually, you know, I should pause the recording. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whatever part of the world you're joining us today in. This is the Data Use Ontology workshop being put on by the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, as well as the implementation arm of GA4GH, which is called the Genomics and Health Implementation Forum. So please note, we will be recording this meeting. So if you don't wish to be recorded, just please keep your video and sound off. And then also, while we have our speakers pending, please do keep your microphone on mute to avoid any background noise. And then later on, once we enter the discussion period, feel free to turn on your camera and unmute as you wish. So just to set the stage a little bit, so this workshop is being held under the umbrella of what we call the Genomics and Health Implementation Forum. So the Genomics and Health Implementation Forum, or the GIF, is all about, collective learning between groups, identifying areas of collaboration and resource sharing, and advancing pilot projects for global data sharing. So if we think of GA4GH as the standards developing body, the GIF is kind of that implementation arm of, once we create these standards, how can we actually take them and put them into practice? And I'm not going to spend much time introducing, well, if any, time introducing GA4GH today, but I do encourage you to check out ga4gh.org and feel free to email our secretariat team if you have any questions. And so this is the second workshop in an implementation forum webinar series we've been holding. So we had a large meeting in early March, and then as a follow-up to that, we've been holding a series of workshops on various GA4GH standards. So in April, we had a pedigree connect-a-thon. So that was a kind of a get-together to discuss our pedigree standard that's being developed. This is, of course, is the DUO workshop. And then next month, we're having a webinar on the variation representation specification. And so I've added just a link there at the bottom if that interests you. Please join us. It will be about an hour-and-a-half webinar on June 2nd. And so just to introduce the speakers today. So my name is Lindsay Smith. I am a project manager and member of the GA4GH Secretariat. Kicking off our workshop today is Tiffany Botwood. She's a managing director at Australian Genomics and is going to give us a high-level introduction to DUO as well as the scope of the use cases. Next, we'll have Melanie Porteau. She's the metadata standards coordinator at MLEBI. Alongside Jonathan Lawson, who is the product manager, and vice chair of the Data Access Committee at the Broad Institute. And they're going to provide an overview of DUO as well as the DUOS system. And then rounding off the end of our presenters to cover some demo and examples of converting clauses to DUO, including some of the things, some of the policies that have been submitted by attendees. We have Lyndon Zass, who is a project officer at H3 Bionet's Central Node in Cape Town, Haley Clissold, who is a policy officer at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, and Giselle Carey, who is a project coordination officer and help desk lead at MLEBI. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tiffany, who's going to start us off with an introduction.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. So as Lindsay mentioned, my name is Tiffany Botwood. I'm the Managing Director of Australian Genomics, which is the National Genomic Initiative of Australia, and also a driver project of GA4GH. Now, in Australia, we open meetings with a welcome to country, which is in recognition that we're meeting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'm standing on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Bayside, Melbourne. And I'd like to welcome you all to the workshop from wherever you call home, and thank you very much for participating. We're delighted with this attendance today. So we had originally conceived of the idea of this GIF DUO workshop in the carefree, heady days of face-to-face meetings and handshakes, and where mask wearing was primarily the remit of surgeons and superheroes, which ironically, as how many surgeons view themselves, but regardless. So we were going to originally hold this workshop as part of the GA4GH Connect meeting in Germany, March 2020, but 2020 happened. And undeterred, we've resurrected the idea in the hope, particularly for the GIF community, in the hope of facilitating uptake of the data use ontology in new adopters, and also expanding our international duo community. So today's workshop, we're going to be doing that by working through examples of mapping data use permissions and modifiers, and answering and workshopping questions and queries you might have. And many thanks to those of you who have contributed your data use clauses and consent clauses in the registration process to this workshop. So I'm not going to go into the depths of the background of the data use ontology because Melanie and Jonathan will be covering that. But DUO as a GA4GH standard has evolved over some years now, drawing upon earlier work on consent codes and ADAM. And the data use ontology is not, and was never intended to be, an exhaustive catalogue of every possible consent clause or secondary use case. As a community, we think that we're pretty close to the mark on the most frequently applied secondary use permissions and modifiers. However, particularly in the context of interacting with GIF as a new community, we do want to emphasize that if you have a specific use case or notice a real gap in the current Duo scope, we really want you to get in touch and share your thoughts. This is a collaborative community of practice working on a shared ontology, and we work to the principles of the GA4GH to overcome barriers to international genomic data sharing. And this can only be achieved if we're converging and aligning all our disparate efforts. So on that, with that principle, part of the purpose of this workshop was to invite GIF members, and that means you, to join the Duo workstream and contribute to ongoing development and refinement and evolution of this standard, because it's a tremendously important and impactful body of work with real benefits to both researchers in sort of efficiency gains and discoverability of data sets, as well as research participants in ensuring that their preferred use permissions and modifiers are honoured in future downstream secondary research use. So, well, apart from that, I guess the Duo workstream, we're a lovely bunch of people from all over the world who volunteer our time, often at ridiculous hours of the day, to contribute to Duo, and we're really keen for you to join us. So please feel free to reach out to either the speakers here today or Justina Chung from GA4GH if you'd like to be part of the Duo team. So that was really my wrap up and call to arms. So I'm going to pass over to Melanie and Jonathan for the next phase of the presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tiffany. All right. So there are slides now. So if you do not see the slides, please let us know. I'm going to keep this really short because we really want to maximize the discussion time at the end. So this is really just a tiny bit of context setting for the data use ontology and a very, very short intro to what it is if you're coming from a little bit less of a familiar background with the resource. On the next slide, Lindsay, please. The current hierarchy of Duo, what's in there? There's two main branches. One branch is about permission terms for things that you are allowed specifically to do a specific area of researches, so for example, general research use. And the second branch on the right-hand side there is modifier terms, things that add extra requirements or limitations on those generic permission. And you'll see examples of usage in the clause translation part. On the next slide, I just really wanted to give you a very quick look at what a DUO term looks like. Every term has a label and an ID. So this one is disease-specific research. The ID is a little bit small. It's DUO 000007. All those IDs are resolvable, so they're all URL. You can click on that link and it will take you to that web page. They're positioned in a hierarchy. Every term has a definition. We're all human. We like knowing what we're talking about. So definition and optionally comments, examples, additional information for human consumer of the standard. On the next slide, please. So DUO has been approved as a GF4GH product in January 2019. It's been built, as Tiffany mentioned, on community contribution and pre-existing efforts. The scope of DUO is really promoting data sharing. So it's not about being able to represent every possible condition. It's about saying, we found those are the most useful conditions. Are those applicable to you? And if they're not, let's talk about it. We have a governance policy guiding the evolution of the resource, and it can evolve. It's not fixed in time. So we support versioning. The DUO IDs remain stable, and the latest version is always available consistently at that URL. So every time we do a release, we push the latest version and we store the previous version based on the date versioning. On the next slide, please. So DUO in practice, how does it work? Through the consent form that patient or research participant agree to the data deposition from a data depositor, the consent that's captured in the form is translated in DUO clause, and those clauses are attached to the data set in a data repository. So you can see here, the consent is about a disease-specific type of research, and that data set would join the data repository and get his little DUO tag, his dark navy blue tag attached there at the same time. On the other hand side, for the data request, on the next slide, please. So as a data requester, so you're a researcher and you're studying melanoma, then you would fill in a data access request saying, I'm looking for that DUO term data sets that are consented for melanoma research. And that goes to a data access committee that can try and match your dark navy label with the existing label on the data repository. And you can see how instead of having to read text requests and match different heterogeneous statements on data sets, this just really become a label matching for the data access committee. And Jonathan will show a little bit more how that looks like in practice. My final slide, the next one, please, Lindsay. So this workshop is really about helping the community, you and your initiative, to start using DUO. How do you get started with DUO? How do you map your consent form clauses to DUO? How can you technically implement DUO? Who can I ask if you have any request? Where can you seek assistance? So those are questions that we are trying to answer here today. And with that, I will pass on to Jonathan, who will give you a little bit of a technical demo of a system implementing DUO.
Sure. Thank you, Melanie, and thanks, Tiffany. I'm taking over screen sharing here. So what I'll be going over today, just briefly, how we, as Melanie said, have put DUO into practice in Broad's data use oversight system called DUOs. So apologies for the very similar acronyms. But really in DUOs, just as Melanie described, we handle three main processes. One is the registration of a data set. So that would involve tagging the data sets with data use ontology terms, as Melanie just described, and that's what you see at left. And then at the right, we have data access request applications. So those would be requests for secondary data use sent to data access committees to gain access to that controlled access data. And what we do in DUOs, and really one of the most unique things about it is the fact that we, on the data sets and on the data access requests, describe those in terms of the data use ontology terms. And that really, as Melanie was saying, helps us kind of compare similar terms or sort of apples to apples, in a sense, making it easier for the data access committee to read and review those. And then what we also do, leveraging the ontological format of Duo is we've actually structured a matching algorithm that takes the data use terms and the data access request described in terms of the Duo, and then decides if that request is within the permitted uses that the data use of the data set describes. So just to show you a few quick examples of how this works. So for data custodians or data depositors, you're able to register a data set in Duos with a lot of kind of typical metadata about a data set, but I think most interestingly for our purposes today, you're able to describe one of the primary sets here, whether your data set would be allowed for general research use, health, medical, biomedical, disease-related studies, and then you'd be able to select one from the disease ontology and then add any of these modifiers. And some of these need to be updated according to the recent release, but that is how that would work in Duos. And then you would be able, once you've done this, to go to the dataset catalog in Duos and to really clearly see the use permissions described in that human readable text on all of the data sets. And then the other option, as I said, on the other side of this is the data access request application, where researchers go in and are able to submit a request and to describe it in terms of Duo. And just to jump to that page really quickly, you would have selected a data set, filled out some of your personal information on this first page, and then on the second step, of the data access request process, you're able to go in and to describe your research use statement below narratively, but up here, again, in terms of the Duo. And that's how we would really get those terms in compatible formats so that the Human Data Access Committee is able to read the human readable definitions, and the algorithm would be able to compare them ontologically to offer a suggested decision to the Data Access Committee. And that's just a quick overview of how we're using Duos. And I'll pass it on from there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Yes, sure can.
Okay, thank you. So from here, we'll just start working through some of the exemplar clauses. Some of them were submitted, and then some from our differing groups and organizations, just to try and illustrate how you would apply different sort of DO terms to your data clauses. Next slide, please. So first, before we get into the clauses themselves, I just wanted to explain a bit about the approach we use in H3 Africa. In H3 Africa, we've got several projects that they use consent forms, but we also have an overall data access agreement that applies to all H3 Africa projects. And the way we go about interpreting these forms is usually by first trying to identify the data use permissions permittable for a specific project, and then I'm trying to identify the modifiers within the clause. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of the first examples we've got. I'll first go through some data use permissions, and then I'll go through some data use modifiers. So you can see some examples on the left. We've got, in the future, the information and samples that you provide for the study may be used to study other diseases by other investigators. And data can be shared with other scientists for health research in any field. So both of these clauses specifically imply research is allowed in some type of health or medical or biomedical field of research. And there's a specific Duo code for this. Sorry, I'm just checking the question. Okay. Yeah, so you'll see the definition is this data use permission indicates the use is allowed for medical research and does not include the study of population origins or ancestry. And then you've got the ID, as Melanie mentioned previously, you've got that on the bottom end and the shorthand abbreviation. Next slide, please. So in some cases, some clauses would specify a more specific data use permission, more specific than medical. For example, research must be specifically related to the condition originally studied. And in the bottom one, you've got sort of an option, data being made available online database, and the data will be used for either research into schizophrenia and related disorders or into any medical use. So their data would probably be subdivided based on their permissions, and it could either be the previous health, medical, and biomedical research, or it could be the DO code for disease-specific research, and the definition for that would be use permission indicates that the use is allowed, provided it's related to a specified disease, and that disease definition would usually come from a disease-specific ontology, such as the disease ontology or human phenotype ontology. Next slide, please. And then the final data use permission is general research use. This is when data is permitted for any type of research, not specifically medical, and the way that would look in clauses are the two examples on the left. So other doctors and scientists at this and other research centers may want to use your sample and information collected through the study for further research for the purpose of advancing knowledge. This data will be shared with all personal information removed and replaced with the study code. And then at the bottom, my data can be shared with other investigators for research in any field once the ethics committee has approved the new study. So the bottom clause also alludes to a data modifier, which I'll get into on the next slide. Okay, so this data modifier is ethics approval required, and that indicates that the requester must provide some evidence of ethics approval for the study they intend to conduct using the data. So and another example of that would be, I also provide consent to share my sample and information collected through the study with all personal information removed with other ethically approved research that may or may not be related to this research project. So again, the data use permission here would be general research use, and then it should be ethically approved. Next slide, please. This is another data use modifier called collaboration required. And in this modifier, it indicates that the requester must agree to collaborate with a primary study investigator. And the way that would look in a clause is you agree to make best efforts to collaborate with representatives of the originating laboratory, or any future requester must collaborate with the primary study investigators. Next slide, please. So I wanted to pause briefly on this data use ontology ID, just to explain how we use it in HA Africa and maybe applicable to some other groups as well. So in HA Africa, we obviously work with a lot of historically disenfranchised groups, and we are very sensitive about how the data is used. So you'll see in the clause on the left, it indicates other researchers and commercial users may have access to these samples or data for future unspecified use research after clearance with ethics committees and relevant authorities. So it specifically mentions commercial use, but there is no dual code that specifically states commercial use. There is a dual code for not-for-profit, non-commercial use only. And we actually use that code a lot. So the way we've interpreted the use of that is when a clause or consent form does not include the specific statement of commercial use, then we automatically apply the non-commercial use only code just to prevent any exploitation of data from disenfranchised communities. Not everyone has to use it that way. That's just a consideration made by the Data Access Agreement of HA Africa. So you can see the not-for-profit, non-commercial use only code is also split up into specifically the non-commercial use only and not-for-profit organization use only. So you can get down to specifics with regards to those concerns. And with that, I think that's my last clause I've got, and I'll pass over to the next facilitator.
Hi, thanks, Lyndon. So hello, everybody. I'm Hayley Clissold, and I'm based at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, and I'm going to go through how we've used data access agreements to implement Duo onto our data sets. Next slide, please. So all of the Sanger datasets that we share in the EDA are shared according to a data access agreement, and all of these have got very similar terms of use, but individual datasets can have additional unique usage restrictions that we can apply Duo to. Next slide, please. So on my slides, on the left-hand side, I've copied over clauses from the agreement, and on the right, you'll be able to see the corresponding Duo code. So in this first example, the clause in the agreement states that the user agrees to only use the data for research purposes. And so this translates to the general research use Duo term, which is Duo 42. Next slide, please. We do have some data sets that can only be used for certain disease research. So an example here is a UK 10K data set, which can only be used for congenital heart disease research. So to map this onto Duo, we've used the disease-specific research Duo, or Duo 7. And to specify the disease, we've matched it with a Mondo Ontology 5453, which specifies congenital heart disease. Next slide, please. So moving on to the modifiers, another clause that we have in some agreements are that the user agrees not to transfer the data to anybody who's not listed as an authorized user on the agreement. So this maps onto the user specific restriction, DRA 26, which indicates that the use is limited to use by approved users. Next slide, please. Similarly, another clause is that the user agrees to use the data for use in an approved research project, which is outlined in the application process. So in this case, we would use DRA 27, which indicates that the use is limited to a particular approved project. Next slide, please. And then finally, another clause that I wanted to highlight in the agreements are that the user agrees to abide by publications policy, and this includes respecting a publication moratorium associated with the data. So in this case, we would apply Duo 24, which is the publication moratorium, and we would couple that with an expiry date to indicate when that publication moratorium is up. So I think I'm going to hand over to Giselle now to give the EGA perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Hayley. So my name is Giselle Kerry, and I'm the Senior Project Coordinator and Help Desk Lead for the European Genome Phenome, which you'll probably most likely know as the EGA. What I'm going to do is talk you through a couple of examples of Duo that can be seen on the EGA web pages, and also some examples that we've been sent through Help Desk and through by some of yourselves as well, and basically show how these are adapted and then put into data use ontologies and later reflected on the EGA websites. Next slide, please. So for those that don't know, the EGA is a managed access archive. So this basically means anybody who wants to access data that's held at the EGA, they have to apply for access through the Datasets Data Access Committee. So this in essence means that every data set within EGA could actually be tagged with the Duo 26, which basically states that the data is only available to approved users. Next slide, please. So this next one is quite an interesting one, and although it's not so commonly used at the moment, we expect as EGA becomes federated and lots of mini EGAs begin to pop up across Europe, that we'll start to see a greater use of the Duo 22, which basically stipulates that data has to remain within a specific geographical location. And so the way that this would be displayed within the EGA is by the use of the data use ontology number 22, and that would be combined with an ISO as well, so that we could actually then identify which region it goes with. So in this instance, if someone were to email into Help Desk and say, we've got some data, we want to share it with you and to share it onwards, but the data, sensitive data must remain in Germany, we would suggest them that they use this data use ontology 22 with the appropriate ISO alongside. Next slide, please. So what is really nice from an EGA Help Desk perspective is obviously we love the fact that people come to us because they want to share their data. But what we also really like is when those people that share the data with us instigate within their data access agreement that they require that their requesters who go on to use that data, that they actually use that themselves and make it public within their own studies and share onwards. The other thing that people can do is some kind of, merging data use ontologies here so that you can kind of see the way things can work. So if they wanted to ensure that their requesters go on to use the data and make it public within another study, would suggest they use the data use ontology number 19. But they could also go on to say, okay, we want people to use our data, but they can only use it for 1 year. We'd also then encourage them to use the data use ontology 25 and then apply appropriate integer next to it. So for example, we have the ICGC DAC at the moment, and they actually only grant access for 1 year at any one time before the users have to reapply. Next slide, please. So this is just a screenshot basically from one of the studies that we have here at EGA. So you can kind of see how it's tagged up and how it looks when you go to the dataset page itself. And actually this is one of the datasets from H3 Africa, as you can possibly see in the dataset description. So you can see that the way that this is being tagged up, it means that the dataset can be used for health, medical or biomedical purposes, but it cannot be used for population or ancestry research. It has project-specific restrictions, which means so when the person has applied for access to the data, they've detailed the project in which that data is going to be used. So when the access is approved, they can only use the data within that project. If they then wanted to use the data in an additional project, they would need to reapply for access so that they could then use it within the new project. You can also see that the publication is required with DUO 19. So as I said in the previous slide, basically, this is stipulating that after they've worked with the data themselves, they then need to also publish on it for the greater good, and so the rest of the scientific community can see it. And another one, which Hayley touched on earlier as well, is the publication moratorium. So here they've used the data use ontology 24, and then they can apply. People can then see that when they're applying for the data, that obviously they can use the data, but won't be able to publish on it for a certain amount of time. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide, actually. So this is just to highlight again about how you can restrict your data usage so that it's only used for a specific data for specific disease, specific research. So again, you'd use the data use ontology number 7. And in this instance, you can see we've applied the Mondo code, which is actually for breast cancer. So this data can only be used for breast cancer research. So the really useful thing about the data use ontology for EGA and for the data access committees, in case it hasn't come across earlier, is that actually when you come into EGA now as a data requester, you can actually search the EGA data sets on data use ontology. So you can specifically go in, type in the DUO code, you'll actually see it pull back all of the data sets that have been tagged with that data use ontology. So for example, if you went in for general research use only, you would see that it pulls out hundreds of data sets now. So you could, it opens up a whole wealth of data sets that could be used. And then also from a data access committee perspective, as far as I can understand, hopefully Hayley might be able to comment on this, it's actually also restricting the number of unnecessary applications that are coming into data access committee. So people aren't wasting time in applying for data sets because they don't know what the conditions are up front. And in turn, you know, the data access committees aren't wasting time fielding unnecessary questions. So I think that's it from my perspective and from the EGA. Thank you very much.
Okay, so at this time, we are ahead of schedule, so we have lots of time for discussion and Q&A. So let me just stop sharing here. So at this time, if you have any questions, whether it's about DUO itself, maybe you submitted a DUO code and we didn't address it and you'd like to learn more about that specific mapping, what we're going to do is either please put your question in the chat, or just to avoid everyone, you know, talking at once, just use the raise hand function and we'll call on you. But maybe to kick us off, I see a question here from Alessandro. So in case of overlap between multiple DUO codes, what documentation is available for interpretation of overlaps and conflicting terms?
Everybody's being very quiet. I guess that the reason we're being quiet is I cannot think of a case of overlap between multiple duo codes. Do you have perhaps an example, Alessandro, in mind? Or
Oh, hi, Melanie. Thanks for
Hi.
picking my question. I'm new to Duo, so I don't have examples in mind. I was just wondering if when adding a new code to the list, it's already reviewed against everything else to anticipate potential conflicts or confusion from end users.
so so you're talking about adding a new duo terms to the ontology, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, let's say that today the list of Duo codes only includes this data cannot be used commercially for any reason. Then there is new Duo code added 6 months later, which introduces usage for commercial reasons for specific therapeutic areas. What happens with the overlap?
Great, thanks for clarifying. That really helps, and that's a really good question. So one of the things that arguably I went really fast. So as I mentioned, Duo keeps evolving. So you're entirely right that there is opportunity to add new terms and so on. I did mention very briefly that we have a governance policy. The link is in the slides as well. Very, very briefly, there's not one person who's modifying Duo. So it's very much of a community effort, like Tiffany described. So when somebody creates a tracker, an item on a tracker saying, hey, I have a request for that new term, this gets discussed by the Duo contributors group. So we have regular teleconferences. We look at supporting use cases. We look at existing data set and how that would interact with a possible new term. So it's not a fast process because there's due diligence being made. There are criteria to add terms to Duo. As Tiffany and others mentioned, it's not meant to represent absolutely everything. So some of the criteria include from the submitter showing that the term would be very useful across many data sets, that it would actually promote data sharing and related things. So at this point in time, at least, I cannot think of overlapping Duo term. I think when new requests are made, the community is being really careful, and we have lots of real experts in the domain. So we're trying to avoid that. And I don't know what would happen if we were not successful, because it's been working for now. Does that help?
Yes, Melanie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And we have a add-on to Alessandro's question. If the mapping file of the terms and code can be provided, that would be helpful. So Melanie, I suppose, can that be provided?
I looked at the slide before the workshop, and I thought this is a really great resource, and we should try and make it a table or something on our documentation. One of the things we've talked about with Jonathan in particular was a bit, overhauling our documentation, making it a little bit clearer. How do you start? How do you add terms? So I think that's a great suggestion and something we'll work on. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie. So this question is for Giselle. Can EGA data sets be searched for phenotypes such as age and sex and data use ontologies?
So that I think I have just started to reply in the chat actually. So that's a really good question. So I've kind of just looked in the search bar and just typed in a data use ontology and cancer, just say really high level phenotype, and that worked. But I'm thinking, from the look of Nancy's question, she possibly wants to drill down a bit further. So that's something I'll take back to the team and find out and pass back to Nancy directly, because that's a really interesting use case, actually, if we can do something like that. So I'll take that back for you.
Thanks, Giselle. So next question, can you talk about choices for disease ontology that pairs with a disease-specific research term? I know Mondo and disease ontology are in use, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts or predictions on what those options might look like in the mid to long-term future.
I can try and answer that one as well. So the data use ontology doesn't force any specific standard be used with the, in this case, disease specific research term. We do recommend that Mondo be used. The reason for making a recommendation is that if everybody uses Mondo, it's a little bit easier to do the mapping, because then you're matching Duo to Duo and Mondo to Mondo. Now, if for whatever reason your consortium prefers to use, let's say, the disease ontology, that's fine. There will need to be a mapping step at some point. So you will need to either, when people request access, tell them to use the disease ontology for their access request, or you need to be able to do mapping between Mondo and Dio. And there are mapping tools available to do that. For example, at EBI, we have the Ontology cross-reference service that provides those mappings between resources. So the summary is that we don't constrain one ontology choices. Sometimes people have to use SNOMED or Dio, but we recommend that Mondo be used. The reason for Mondo is that it's very rich in those cross-references as well. So a lot of the cross-references, all the Mondo terms are cross-referenced to the disease ontology term when available. So this is just a little bit easier, we think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So next question we have from Pinar. How do we specify permissions to use also by for-profit institutions? Is this implied by the absence of the not-for-profit code?
So I think I'll take that one. From my perspective, yeah, it's implied by that code not actually being used. So if it's not there, then it's okay for for-profit users to apply.
Can I just add on to that question? So in general, so because we using Duo, you specify certain things, and then there are things you didn't say, and what is the outcome of that? So do you complement so this is a question maybe for all the repositories who are implementing Duo, do you complement the terms with an access policy that's like downloadable and actually readable, or do you just have the terms?
So from an EGA perspective, we just purely point to the data use ontology itself. So we don't actually get involved in the data access policies in any way, shape or form. So from our perspective, we're kind of, yeah, we just basically go with whatever the submitter requests us to add to the data sets themselves, if that helps.
Okay.
But for the context of Australian genomics, for example, Pinar, we have the data use ontologies, which we use to tag our data sets, but then we have a suite of data access policies and agreements that are a different layer for controlled access to our data sets. So I think it depends on the use case.
Okay.
And then just from the Issue Africa perspective, our data is submitted to EGA, but then we also have a separate data catalog for Issue Africa, which has reference to the Issue Africa data access agreements where some of those DO codes are derived from.
Yep, and then from a Sanger Institute perspective, I think it's similar to the Australian genomics. We have the agreement that goes into more detail, and then the DO codes are selected from that.
Thank you.
And I see, Pinar, you also asked another very good question with regards to reporting of incidental findings or secondary findings or unsolicited findings, or, potato. The challenge there, I mean, as several of us have mentioned, Duo is not an exhaustive list of all potential restrictions or permissions associated with secondary use of data sets. And I think we should also emphasize the interactions we have with the sort of foundational work stream of, security as well as the regulatory and ethics work stream in GA4GH, in which there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination between development of products associated with, for example, machine readable consent clauses or other products from the regulatory and ethics work stream, as well as with the DURI work stream and specifically with the DUO codes. So it is an evolving landscape.
Okay.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Lyndon.
So I just wanted to mention also with regard to the previous question of incorporating view codes. So we found from the Asia Africa perspective when we initially started mapping to DUO that we also wanted to introduce some new terms, but for the most part, I think the first step is just understanding what the DUO codes that are already incorporated into the ontology encompass. And then once you have a good understanding of that, you can see that most of your use cases will already be applied to the ontology. And then specifically with regards to incidental findings, I think that was also brought up from the Asia Africa perspective, and that's still ongoing on the GitHub. I think we still have a discussion on the GitHub issues tracker with regards to that specific feedback comment.
Okay, thanks, Lyndon. So next question up from Matthias. Is there a connection to the HL7 fire consent or policies or the APPC or BPPC, which I believe is the advanced patient privacy consents and the basic consents?
I can try and answer. So the short answer, Matthias, hi, not yet. We had started looking a little bit into that, but voluntary effort, it did fall a little bit off track. That being said, we just talked about that again last week. So there was a Phenopacket workshop where they had talked to FHIR to add the link to Phenopacket. And I said, hey, we want to add DUO to FHIR as well. So I have an email to follow up on with somebody called Devara to check on how to do that. I believe Stephanie is on the call today as well, and I know she had talked with FHIR for consent codes. So I think I see there's another question around adding it to the content resource. I think it's not technically hard to do, it just needs to happen at some point. So there's a dialogue that needs to start, and so that's in progress. And if anybody on the call here wanted to help with the process, that would be really appreciated, because I don't know anybody either in FHIR or AHE. So if anybody is able to do that bridging for us, that'd be really helpful.
Great, and I see there's a similar question here. So does the FHIR consent resource map well to DUO and vice versa? And there's a link provided to that consent resource.
Yeah, so that's the second part, is that so in FHIR there's the content resource, which says here are the list of codes you can use with the content resource. And some of those codes are coming from existing vocabularies, and we just like to be able to add DUO codes as part of the allowed, I guess, categories of codes in there.
Okay, great. So we have a next question here from Jeffrey. Are there any mappings between ontologies used in DUO and other standards / ontologies for clinical data sets? I'm interested in understanding if there are any patterns where we can make the full 360-degree view available for researchers, which includes associated clinical data, also which is relevant to the research area.
I think I struggle to understand a little bit the question, Jeffrey, sorry. So DUO is one ontology. You can use DUO in conjunction with other ontologies such as Mondo when you want to say disease-specific research and that disease is cancer, but there are not other ontologies used in Duo, so I'm not quite clear which mapping you'd like to establish. Maybe if you could clarify?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I'm trying to understand is, a researcher will come in with a specific research area that is clearly documented here in the codes used by Duo. We also hold a variety of clinical sort of data associated to our participants, and I'm trying to work out how we link across both, if that makes sense. So we've got all of the clinical data associated with participants that we have at GEL. So I'm just trying to get an idea of mapping across from Duo to other areas as well. So that could be ICD-10, OPCS, yeah. Does that make sense? Or
a little bit. So maybe I'll try and answer and let me know if it's not quite complete. So the way you would map between, disease captured, let's say using SNOMED or ICD-10 or DO, and an existing Duo. So let's say a data set is tagged with Duo 7 for disease specific research and Mondo, I forgot the ID, but let's say Mondo cancer.
Yeah.
And your clinical data for the patients is that patient has cancer, but their cancer is encoded using ICD-10 cancer. So the way you would map between both, if you wanted to, you'd have to use an ontology cross-reference, cross-mapping tool. So at EBI, we use the OXO tool, which you can give it a specific ID, and it will give you a list of all the mappings it knows of. So it will say, okay, Mondo cancer maps to SNOMED 123, ICD 456, DO 978, and so on and so on. But there's no built-in mapping in Duo. You need to use a separate tool to do the mapping themselves, but there are tools providing those.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so that answers my question, and it's what patterns are there out there that organisations use that are using Duo to map across to other clinical ontologies like ICD-10 or SNOMED. So yeah, that tool like called OXO sounds interesting. But yeah, if there's any other approach.
I'll put the link in the chat for OXO.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, thanks.
Okay, so next I see we've got two questions here from Suzanne. So the first is for Giselle. Who adds the Duo terms to the data sets at EGA? The data depositors / the help desk staff, or is there a certain level of automation?
So at the moment, it's done in conjunction between the submitter emailing into help desk, and it's done as part of the submission process. So the data submitters will basically say to us, these are the data use ontologies we'd like to add to our data sets. And we then go away and run a little script that adds it on the web page. But you can also, if you're a programmatic submitter, you can do it yourself. Although we don't tend to see that many programmatic submitters at the EGA at the moment. So predominantly it's done through help desk. That said, our online submitter portal is going to be updated and refreshed, we hope, in the next few months. And as part of that process, the submitters will actually be able to put the data sheet ontology codes into their submissions themselves. So won't actually be reliant on help desk doing that for them.
Okay, and the second question from Suzanne is, can Duo be used to guide the design of clauses for consent forms? And I saw, Tiffany, you added in the chat about the machine readable consent guidance. Did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And in fact, Suzanne, the sort of thread of your questions around who is ascribing duo codes to data sets. And that was basically the original premise behind the machine readable consent guidance product that was a collaboration between the duo group and the regulatory and ethics group. And the idea here is that if we develop template consent clauses that map unequivocally through to the duo codes, then in fact it's the research participant who is selecting their own permissions and modifiers associated with secondary use on their data. And we can, rather than being reliant upon a help desk, we're actually confident that the participant themselves is assigning the duo codes to the use sets of their data. So I have added the link there, and we've actually, so Dr. Matilda Hayes, who's on the call today, she's developed a participant platform with dynamic consent embedded that has consent clauses that map through to duo codes in plain language that allows participants to select directly the secondary use permissions and modifiers associated with their data sets.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tiffany. Going down to the next question here. Can you comment on the process of taking a patient consent and converting it to a duo code? Are there cases hard to map, and how are they handled? Who'd like to take that one?
Everyone takes a step back. I guess from our perspective, and I think, I mean, I've been involved in the jury work stream for a little while now. And the more consent, so the more participant information and consent forms you see, there is a great degree of similarity around permissions and modifiers associated with secondary use clauses. And it might be, you know, specific, you know, disease specific. It might be ethics is a really common one in Australia, the requirement for ethical review. But generally there will be key phrases that pop out. So for example, I agree that my data be used for other ethically approved research studies. And then immediately you can recognize, you know, the associated duo code. It is, you know, an element of it is practice. And, you know, we were kind of hoping this workshop would be an opportunity for people to see that translation of consent clauses through to duo codes. We might have to resurrect the idea of a buddy system associated with jury, just to have some more tangible, smaller one-on-one or small group workshops to help work through tricky cases, or perhaps a system of people can submit consent clauses that are tricky for consultation with a broader group.
Thanks, Tiffany. So next up, question. Can hierarchy of terms be accessed when searching for a term? Say, for example, I would want to search for colorectal cancer. Would I also be able to see the root node and the subnodes that lead to colorectal cancer, considering that some terms might not be accessible publicly?
This one is, I think, I think there's two questions in there. There's one question which is pertaining to searching in a data repository for data sets that are about colorectal cancer. And there's a question around doing the same for the dual secondary usage of the data. I will have to say that this is a repository implementation specific choice. So the hierarchy exists in both duo and the disease ontology. So you could leverage it. Whether it is leveraged is a choice from the repository doing the implementation. So some repository may want to just do a strict ID matching. I do believe in duos, the hierarchies being leveraged, as Jonathan mentioned, but that's implementation dependent. I don't think there's a single proof. Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, I would just to give an example, right? Not to say this is standard, but the implementation that we've done at the Broad in our dataset catalog is that if I were doing research on colorectal cancer and I put that in my search query in the catalog, you would then be returned all of the datasets listed that were disease specific for colorectal cancer, but then also likely anything that was permitted for cancer research or general HMB, health, medical, biomedical, and anything that's GRU. So it's ostensibly all the data sets that a DAC would be likely to approve you for would be returned to you. So you're kind of searching by data use, called data use aware search at Broad.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan and Melanie. So next question, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit before, but what kind, and are there any mechanisms in place to avoid and or prevent conflicting duo codes being applied?
I am not aware of, so I think if you wanted to say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example of duo codes that are conflicting, but I think if there were conflicting duo codes and you decided to apply them to your data sets, there's no mechanism that I know of preventing you right now, but I don't think there are conflicting codes.
Melanie,
right
so
now.
I can think of an example.
Go ahead, yeah.
So it would be probably in a case where a data depositor applies the duo codes themselves, maybe for data use permission, they would apply both the disease-specific research code as well as the general research use code, which would then be in conflict to the data use permission. So that could be an example of conflicting codes.
So I'm not sure I'm understanding, Linda. Why are they conflicting?
Yeah, but for example, if you had, Melanie, if someone submitted data that was tagged with health, medical, biomedical, as well as population and ancestry, when they're mutually exclusive.
Yes, that's a good example of conflicting. Thanks, Tiffany. So I don't think there's a mechanism in the way the duo codes are being applied to the data sets at the moment that would prevent that. That's probably a question for Giselle and Lyndon and Hayley. So I guess my mechanism at the moment is Giselle. But
yeah, I think from the EGA side, it is really down for the help desk team to spot it and highlight it to the people that are requesting it to be applied. So yeah, I will highlight it to the the help desk team to double check that things don't look like they conflict. But yeah, I guess that's, yeah, there's no way of automatically stopping that happening. It would need manual intervention, certainly from our side anyway.
Right.
Or not yet.
Right. And I think what our hope is in sharing the visual that Melanie presented, which delineates the permissions versus the modifiers, is that the documentation would say choose one permission. So you wouldn't pick two of those mutually exclusive terms and then add modifiers as needed, right? So you could do that. And I think really, since what we're trying to do at GA4GH is maintain standards and not govern implementations, but certainly assist them, I think we may not move too far into making sure there's governance over those different implementations. So I think that's why we've sort of intentionally drawn a line and not force that.
Okay, great, thank you. So next question, is there a duo, or I suppose a duo term, on IT security requirements? Given the GDPR in Europe, the DAC has to ensure a certain level of IT security measures, which have to be in place at the requester's institution.
So I'll speak to this if that's okay. So there isn't one, in short, but I could from my perspective, I could certainly see a use case for it. So would suggest adding it to the GitHub repository so that we can discuss it. I don't know, Melanie, if you want to comment on that, or Tiffany.
Yeah, I guess to what extent are the security standards associated with repositories, etc., in the context of the GA4GH community, for example, the requirements around security and access are defined to a great extent by the foundational workstream of security. And it's, I guess, to what extent is that then redundant in the context of Duo? I don't know, Melanie, do you have other thoughts?
I don't really. I'm thinking this probably deserves future discussion with the group. So I put the link to the GitHub issue tracker. Niklas, if you were willing to submit a ticket about that. Ideally, if you had examples of data sets that would benefit from that code and how the code would actually benefit, either the data requester or the data depositor, or just a little bit of information about how that code would be used and by whom, I think that would be really helpful for further discussion, but that's a great point.
Yeah, I'll do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And so I'm going to jump down to this question from Simon, because I think it's a good opportunity to highlight some of the work of colleagues in Japan. So have you had many cases of projects converting non-English consent forms into Duo? Were there any challenges of capturing the nuance of what had been consented to?
Yes, I know. So I had the great opportunity to work with our colleagues in Japan on converting their consent clause into Duo. But they did do the conversion into English first. So they took care of the nuance of the clause. That being said, I don't remember how to say a confusion arising from the language. So when they looked at the Japanese consent clauses, they were very clear on what that would mean in English and whether the Duo term that we thought was applicable was the right one. So there was no language issue.
Yeah, similarly, in Asia Africa, we also had to derive the Duo codes from some French consent forms, but we didn't have much problems. We did have a bilingual French and English speaking project member who facilitated that mapping process, but I don't think there was any confusion with regards to which mappings applied.
A last point, perhaps with respect to language, is so we acknowledge the diversity of communities and languages for Duo. So we've started an effort to translate Duo in different languages. Tiffany also led on translating Duo in plain language. We need to find a way to release those consistently with the ontology. So, but at the moment we had, I think Jonathan led on the Spanish. I worked with Francis and Jean on the French, Nancy, and I think Nancy's on the call today, led on the German. So we had a couple of translation of the clauses themselves, and hopefully that will also help broader adoption. But thanks for the question, Simon.
Great, thanks, Melanie. So the next question I see here from Chris, which has already been answered in the chat, so the question is, I realize that Duo has grown specifically from human data as an use case, but are there any reasons why they can't be used on non-human data usage? And Melanie, I see you responded to that in the chat. Did you want to expand on that at all?
I think that's a great question. I really like that question. So from the Duo perspective, you can use it for anything you want, right? It's a vocabulary that's released. The use you make of it is under your own responsibility, pretty much. It's a bit of a buyer beware. And as a side note, we've also been thinking about using Duo with samples for biobanks and things like that. So, there are opportunities to expand on what Duo can be applied to. For Chris' specific question, I think it's a great question. You know, Tiffany was touching a little bit earlier on benefit sharing and communities that require data coming back to them, and Lyndon touched on that as well. So there's nothing preventing you using Duo, for example, with viral data that you'd submit to ENA. And actually, I had a chat with, so that came up 2 weeks ago as well. I had a chat with Guy O'Crane, who leads ENA, and he did say he was open to adding the field for addition of Duo code in the resource. The main concern was those resources, those data repository typically have a mandate on providing open access data. So there's a concern, does adding a Duo code, even if it's a code such as non-commercial use only, that would actually, would that go against the open access mandate, for example, for INSDC? So I think those are discussions that are ongoing, and it may be that the ENA in particular decide to allow only a subset of Duo codes.
So I was just going to add a point to that. So while it's, you know, I think it's a really great idea to kind of tag them up, but it's still reliant on people being honest. If they're coming into open resources as a commercial user, seeing that data there, seeing the tag, and then thinking, well, no one's stopping me because it's an open resource, and just downloading it anyway. So it's kind of not, it's not going to restrict the access by that group that you want to stop accessing it, if that makes sense. I think that's my only point there, but I definitely think, you know, wherever we can encourage the use of data use ontology, I think is a great idea.
Can I just add on top of that then? So thank you for answering it. That's great. We can use it wherever, including in GigaDB, which is the resource that I run. But would there be scope to use the like the GitHub issue tracker and Duo to ask for extra things and things that are not necessarily human related, or are you guys only concentrating on the human aspect of data sharing?
I guess you can ask.
Okay.
We may, so as you know, Chris, Duo is in ontology, and we try really hard to restrict the scope. So the scope right now is really around human data. As I said, we've thought about different scopes like samples. There's things that are slightly different, and I believe actually Nancy, you had submitted clauses around sample usage. And we all think this would be great. We are not quite sure whether it's a Duo core mission or whether it's an extension to Duo that would be separated. So there's a balance between, you know, keeping it small, narrow scope, very usable, easy to implement, and increasing the scope. But in short, we're open to the discussion. We are not promising we will support all, but we're willing to discuss it.
Okay, thank you.
And the biosample issue has come up, you know, beyond the clauses that Nancy submitted. There has been questions in the chat along these lines too, particularly around biosamples. So, you know, I agree. I think it's something we should definitely explore.
Okay, thanks everyone. So another question here from Simon. I think Giselle, you kind of just touched on this a little bit. Will data depositors be able to define the setting for data access? For example, it could be that the data may only be accessed via a trusted research environment with access controls, or may be downloaded and used locally.
Sorry, I'm just so I think, yes, I did touch on that briefly. So I think, I don't know, Simon, if you're talking about restricting access to various locations, are you? Or did you want to elaborate on that a bit further? I don't know if you're there to talk to us.
Yes, thank you. I mean, in terms of the sort of more local setting as to where the data is being accessed. So, for example, I know, you know, the EGA, or, you know, people are sort of downloading and generally accessing through their institutions, but it might be that actually you want them to, the data to remain in a more of a sealed off environment whereby, you know, the researchers themselves can't actually take the data out of that secure environment, but it's managed access. And I just wondered whether that sort of nuance is possible in the current setup, or would that have to be added?
So I think that's another layer up from the one I talked about in the slides earlier. So I think again there's possibly a use case for that. So if you'd like to create a GitHub issue so that we could discuss it, I think that would be good.
Okay, thank you.
Could that be captured under the sort of general data use modifier, DO 17, and you specify it has to be the compute to data rather than release of data?
Yeah, I guess it could be. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. If you create a GitHub for us, Simon, we'll have a closer look.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, and I think the last two questions I'm seeing here we might have already answered, but just to double check. So are there any pilots that are experimenting with Duo for bioregistries biosamples that capture how these samples should be used? So I think we talked about this a little bit, and please do make a GitHub issue about it. But just checking with the team, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I could just say, I think there are some groups that have done this, biobanks. Forgive me if I'm restating, but I'm not sure how public those implementations are. But I'm certainly also happy to reach out to them as we move forward with answering this via GitHub. But I do know folks have talked with this. I think Jamie, who is one of the co-leads of Dury overall, has also kind of noted this issue of there's maybe additional considerations on the limitations of samples as well. So there are probably a few people we can reach out to and we can follow up with them.
Also, I can mention that from the Asia Africa side, we actually did use Duo for our biosamples consent as well, and we didn't run into many issues. Our clauses though looked very similar for samples and data, so it wasn't an issue for us. So we have actually used Duo to sort of, at least from our catalog perspective, implement the Duo codes for samples as well.
Okay, thanks, Lyndon. And so the last question here we have already answered in the chat, but just to read it out for everyone. So is there a translation to Spanish? And Jonathan replied that we have started the Spanish translation, but could use support in reviewing it before sharing it. So if that's something anyone else here is interested in, please do let us know. So that is all the questions I have so far. I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any other. Yeah, Melanie,
Can
go
I
ahead.
add, Lindsay, for the translation?
Sure.
Thing? So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a couple translation. The bit where it's stuck right now, and for example, I see that Pablo has experience with HPO translation. It's more on the technical side. So when we do a new release and an update on the Duo terms, and then all the translation would need to be updated, but obviously that's an asynchronous mechanism. How do you release first the English version, then you merge in the other translation? So it's more on the process and making sure things don't go out of sync and the right translation goes with the right version in the right release. So that's where it's a little bit stuck at the moment. So if anybody on the call had technical advice on how to handle that, maybe based on HPO, I would love to benefit from your expertise, please.
Hello. Yes. So we have translated HPO terms more or less 7 years ago, and keep updated every 3 or 6 months, on applying with two different teams. One here from Spain using the Spanish terms, and a second team from Latin America, specifically from Colombia, Argentina. And mixing this information together, we keep updated the HPO terms. Every release of the HPO terms are translated. So probably the same steps could be used to keep updated the Duo terms or the Duo wordings.
Yeah, it sounds like it's the, ultimately would be the same mechanism. Do you have some documentation about how that happens in HPO? So I guess, somebody like, I don't know, Sebastian or Peter updates the English version and then you update the Spanish version. How does the core release happen? So if you have any documentation you could share around that, that would really be helpful.
So not exactly. So we did this work in the network of rare disease here in Spain, and we do have the documentation on specific documentation among this network, but not exactly for specific documents to release. This really a work we are doing for free, of course, and using this approach with two different teams, just to be sure that the use of languages is at the same time understandable for both continents.
Would you be okay if we were to invite you at an upcoming duo call, maybe to present how that translation mechanism and release and update is handled in HPO, just to show it to our team so that we could try and apply it on our side as well?
Yes, sure. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. So last call, are there any burning questions left for the Duo team before we wrap up? Thank you. Yeah, I was muted there. So I'll take that silence as a not at the moment. So if you do have any more questions, do please feel free to reach out to us. If you don't know which email to send it to, I think everyone has my email. It's just lindsay.smith@ga4gh.org. Hopefully you received that or some previous emails from me. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you learned a lot about Duo and are interested in either implementing it or joining the efforts. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for their work in putting this together. Duo team, any last words?
No, it's
Thank
been
you,
really,
everybody.
yeah, it's been gratifying to see everyone showing up. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thanks, everyone.
I just saw a last minute question. Do we want to answer it?
Is it an easy one?
Let's see. So is it possible to have different consents in a data set? Patients might consent in different clauses.
Yes.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
In short, yes. So certainly the work of Matilda with the control platform is very much focused on this, where fundamentally individual patients can select their own data use permissions and modifiers. So you basically have a data set of one participant.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So unless there are any last burning ones, I think we will wrap up here. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. And yeah, we'll send out the recording and slides following the event. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.